The first presentation is the 1619 project with Jessica Berman, students Alexander Batska and Eamon Dillon, and right after that we have Michael Lord, who's a member of the Board of Trustees at Historic Hudson Valley, who produced a website, People Not Property, who will sort of complement the first presentation. And it's really fascinating. Judith Beville organized the effort about a month or so or two ago, and I attended the event, and it was one of the most interesting presentations. And the website is, I think, just totally fascinating. So if you love history, this is probably the best meeting that you could ever attend of any town board. So we'll start with Jessica Berman and Alexander Batska and Eamon Dillon.
Good evening. I want to begin by thanking Mr. Feiner for inviting my students to present their research this evening. It's not often that students of the humanities get to present their work to an authentic audience. So this opportunity is a valuable step as we prepare our students for the real world, including college. Ardsley High School certainly supports this kind of venture. I begin each year teaching the Advanced Placement United States History course with the discussion of historiography, explaining that history is in fact alive, our interpretations ever-changing, and each new modern event builds on our experience of and our interpretation of the past. This summer, the New York Times Magazine embarked on the 1619 Project, an in-depth look at how the history of enslaved people is taught, interpreted, and remembered across our nation, and its impact on modern race relations. At the 400-year anniversary of the presence of African people in Jamestown, purchased as chattel by the Virginia Company, the recounting of this history remains inconsistent, often placing an emphasis on the bravery of colonial pioneers, the democratic spirit of the founding figures, or Lincoln's handling of the Civil War, often at the expense of the role enslaved people played in the development of our nation. It was with this particular issue that was tackled by my former students, Alexander Batska and Eamon Dillon, who are here to share their archival research on the role slavery played in the development of New York's economy. This work was genuine, driven by inquiry, and tackled with the support of myself and our library media specialist, Sari Goldmere. We, like Mr. Feiner, hope to encourage others to take a closer look at our local history and the role enslaved people played in the development of Westchester. Perhaps with this understanding, we can push our community toward meaningful civic and cultural engagement that pushes us to advance liberty and equality across the nation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Eamon Dillon.
And I'm Alex Batska.
Last year, in May, our teacher, Miss Berman, tasked us with coming up with our own research question and then answering it for a statewide research competition. After a couple days of brainstorming, we came up with the question on the board behind us, or in front of us, sorry. Our APOS class followed an intensive curriculum, and we learned about the connection between New York and slavery. It is a common belief that slavery was predominantly an issue in the South, but as we set out to prove, there was a very strong pro-slavery sentiment in the North, especially in New York City.
This competition required us to do extensive research by ourselves, but also in archives. To accomplish this, we visited various historical centers, such as the New York Historical Society and the Schomburg Research Center in Harlem. In order to do our research, we contacted many librarians and historians and utilized the help of our teacher and our librarian, Ms. Goldmere. With their help, we found multiple primary and secondary sources that we used to answer our question. We will walk you through our findings, which we presented on the website that we're going to show you, and we're going to kind of show you the connection between our project and Project 1619.
The 1619 Project took a broad look at the issue of slavery in America and the legacy it left behind. While there are several connections between our project and Project 1619, we took a much more narrow perspective and solely focused on the economic connections between slavery in the South and the economy of New York City. One piece we found within Project 1619 that has a direct connections to our research was How Slavery Made Wall Street by T.M. Mills. This was an article posted in the project. The source explained how New York invested heavily in Southern cotton industries through loans and providing insurance for both the enslaved people purchased and the goods produced.
Another piece we found was Cotton in the Global Market by Mirza Baradaran. It talked about the connection between the South, New York, and England, and how they created a chain of reliance on cotton, with New York being the shipping center and England having a wide textile industry. So now we're going to walk you through our website and the findings we had through our research.
As I said previously, we focus specifically on New York City in the pre-Civil War era. I will give a brief background on New York City and its connection to the South. So New York City was originally founded by the Dutch when they landed here in 1624 and settled along the Hudson River. After the Revolutionary War, New York City thrived as the center of commerce in North America. This was largely due to the natural deepwater port, which meant most of the shipping into or out of North America went through New York City. At this time, cotton was the world's most important commodity, and many northern merchants made a profit by becoming involved in the trading process. As time went on and the riches of cotton became more apparent, more New York merchants and businessmen began to invest in the southern cotton and slave trades. One interesting quote we found while doing our research was the quote in the middle of the board. It was said by a Southern editor before the Civil War, and he was describing what he thought New York would be like without slavery. While it is obviously exaggerated, there are some truths to it, as we found in our research and as shown in the 1619 project. I'll just read the quote. The ships would rot at her docks, grass would grow in Wall Street and Broadway, and the flora of New York, like that of Babylon and Rome, would be numbered with the things of the past. This quote has strong parallels to the article posted by T.M. Mills, which I previously talked about.
So the way we compiled the rest of our research and organized it is we took one stance on proving all the pro-slavery sentiment in New York, and then one stance on the anti-slavery New York. So I'm going to address the pro-slavery part. We found evidence of the New York's ties to the South to be undeniable, and this is a page of the website that proves this. Sympathy for the South was indirectly and directly demonstrated by the government, businesses, media, and the working class people. First, in the media, newspapers often spread Southern-influenced propaganda that tried to scare working class citizens in order to have them oppose abolition, because these working class citizens were afraid of freedmen coming to the North and stealing their jobs. Upon visiting the New York Historical Society, we were actually able to hold copies of the Herald from the 1860s, which was one of the most widely read newspapers at the time. In the same newspaper, we found that affluent Southerners often visited New York, and to cater to them, newspapers promoted shows that were often racist and ridiculed African Americans, as white actors dressed up foolishly and donned blackface in an attempt to mock the race. One of these shows was Uncle Pat's Cabin, and this play mocked the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin. This just shows that the culture surrounding New York and New York's renowned entertainment at that time catered to the Southern culture. We also looked at a famous painting called The Fruits of Amalgamation. Amalgamation means combining or mixing, and this painting depicted a mixed family. It played on the fear of white society of the depurification of the race. It basically depicts a black father and a white mother with mixed children. It's significant that it garnered so much popularity in New York because it just shows that there was still racial issues in the North and not just the South, and the fact that it got so popular means that many people agreed with it. As Eamon mentioned earlier, New York was a center of enterprise and trade, and ruining relationships with the South would harm the New York economy. There was even evidence that prominent New York businessmen already had plans in place before secession to move their businesses to Savannah, Georgia. This just shows the ties that New York's businessmen had with the South as well. After reading the economic book, Cotton is King, we found that exports of the South, of 83% of the profit that the South made from its products, cotton was 83% of it. New York was prominent in shipping cotton, so if abolition went through and cotton production slowed down, New York would be extremely hurt. Also, it was estimated that the 5 cotton states, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and Tennessee, provided New York with around $200 million in business. However, New York didn't just deal with cotton. It was also the center of the underground slave trade. Although slavery was abolished in New York in 1827, it still remained the center of the slave trade. Ships in New York shipped slaves from New York to Brazil, South Carolina, Alabama, and Cuba. And the average cargo of 800 enslaved people brought in tens of millions of dollars in today's money. Ties to the South even led to corruption in government and the justice system. There was 125 people prosecuted as slave traders during the 24 years before the Civil War. However, only 20 were sent to prison. Of the 20 that were sent to prison, they served an average sentence of 2 years. And at the time, slave trading was a capital crime, which meant that they had the potential to even get the death penalty, but no one ever received it. This leniency from the Justice Department and the government just shows the true motives of New York. Finally, sympathy for the South and tension turned into violence. Immigrants and workers rioted during the 1963 draft for the Civil War in protest of fighting the Civil War. They were afraid of losing jobs, like I mentioned before, to potentially freed enslaved people that would come north in search for job opportunities. Overall, many in New York didn't actually support the idea of slavery. However, they just didn't want to lose their indirect benefits from slavery. Their opinions and actions were mostly driven by money, but racial issues also played a small part.
So Alex just presented the pro-slavery argument of the people who thought that slavery was actually beneficial, or not beneficial, but good for themselves. And I will present the anti-slavery part of New York. So, although the establishment of slavery garnered much support in New York, it was also met with much opposition as well. This was shown with slavery being abolished in New York in 1827. Even before abolition in New York, slaves faced much support from various religious groups, mainly Quakers and Presbyterians, who offered aid and support. Even here in Westchester, Quakers voted to compensate former slaves for the number of years they spent in bondage and provided aid. This took place in Chappaqua, a town not so far away from here. There was a strong abolitionist movement in New York City led by brothers Arthur and Lewis Tappan, which resulted in the violent riots in 1834. The Tappan brothers founded the Anti-Slavery Society, and there was also a women's anti-slavery society at the time. Within our research, we found several pamphlets and books published by these organizations. Abolitionists, whether societies or individuals, were responsible for the end of slavery and the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, which officially ended slavery. Despite the threat of secession from several New York politicians, it never actually went through, which showed that the majority of people within New York City actually did not support slavery. On one side, there were those who supported slavery for reasons both economic and social. The other side of the argument consisted of abolitionists who wanted the end of slavery in New York and across the nation. New York was clearly divided. Merchants and businessmen, and even some government officials from New York, remained largely pro-Southern and pro-slavery at the height of the Civil War, but many people also did not support slavery. Despite the pro-slavery attitude of New York merchants and politicians, New York ultimately did not secede, showing that the support for the South was not enough to overcome the overwhelming majority who sympathized with the Union and wanted an end to slavery.
Ultimately, we think it's extremely important for students to learn about the institution of slavery. Although it's a brutal and unfortunate part of our country's history, it's crucial that we still remain aware of it, especially because of the long-term implications. Segregation didn't end until the 1960s, 100 years after the Civil War. And even today, the systematic oppression that some African Americans have faced is still affecting the population at many levels. In our current social studies class, we even addressed the segregation of some New York public schools and how African American students aren't being treated as fairly in the admissions process. Sadly, the legacy of slavery still lives on, and the first step we can take for ourselves is learn about it. Thank you.
That was really fascinating. Do you know if there was somebody once told me years ago, I never forgot that where Hartsbrook Preserve is on Ridge Road, that it was used as an underground railroad. Did you, in your research?
No, we didn't come across that, actually.
Yeah, or do you know if there was an underground railroad in this part of the county?
We didn't really study the Underground Railroad as much. We more looked at like the economic ties between New York and the South. So unfortunately, we don't really know about that.
Next project.
So, and what schools are you applying to?
You want to go first?
I don't know.
No pressure.
I don't know. I guess my favorite ones are University of Wisconsin, Villanova, and then I don't know. I can't even think. There are more. I'm just a little nervous right now. I don't know.
I like Michigan, Maryland, and Wisconsin as well.
And what are your goals after you graduate? Do you have any career?
Although it's not very similar to like social studies, I kind of want to be an engineer after college, and yeah, that's where my passion lies.
I'm not really set on anything yet, but I enjoy business, especially like I'm part of the DECA Club, which is a business club at our school, and I really enjoy that. And I also enjoy soccer, so I'm trying to find something that maybe can combine both of those, like something in sports management.
That's great. We both will probably have a very successful career, and this was a really fascinating presentation. So
Thank
I'm
you.
really glad we heard this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Before these gentlemen leave, I just want to say that you'll probably hear it in Michael Lloyd's presentation, but because our town of Greenburgh includes river towns, it is highly likely and highly probable that the town of Greenburgh had many spots, several spots along the Underground Railroad. There is evidence that Phillipsburg Manor was one of those stops because African Americans would leave New York and they knew about the Phillipsburg Manor, and because it was along the Hudson River, would come there to try to hide out and seek protection from the African Americans who lived there as they continued up the Hudson River. So it's very highly likely that Greenburgh played a significant role in the Underground Railroad. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Good luck in your college application.
Yes.
Go do well.
Credit in the record.